There is a photograph of Anthony Avalos that his family kept close for years after he was gone. He is grinning, the way only 10-year-olds can grin, like his whole face can barely contain whatever it is he is feeling. His eyes are bright. His cheeks are round. He looks like a kid who just heard the best joke in the room and is 1 second away from laughing out loud. That photograph, more than any court document, more than any police report, more than any of the 13 calls made to a child abuse hotline before he died, is the one thing that tells you everything you need to know about who Anthony Avalos was, and it makes what happened to him almost impossible to hold in your mind. Almost. Because the same child in that photograph on the afternoon of June 20th, 2018, was found unresponsive on the floor of a home in Lancaster, California, 77 pounds, severely dehydrated, his small body covered in bruises, cigarette burns, belt lash marks, and wounds that doctors would later say were consistent with prolonged, systematic, intentional torture. He had no detectable pulse. His kidneys had shut down. His brain was bleeding. He was so malnourished that his ribs were visible through his skin. And the person who finally called 911 after leaving him on that floor for 2 days was his own mother. He was airlifted to UCLA Mattel Children's Hospital. He did not come back from it. Anthony Avalos was pronounced dead on June 21st, 2018. He was 10 years old. He had been born on May 4th, 2008. He was the fastest runner in his grade. His teacher called him everyone's best friend. He wrote her a letter at the end of his last school year that said, "I just want to stay with you forever, but I can't. I just hope you have a good rest of your life, because you already know that I'm going to have a good life." He believed that. You can feel it in that sentence. He genuinely, completely believed it, and he should have. He had every reason to. He had 13 calls to a child protection hotline that should have saved him. He had 12 social workers who touched his file and moved on. He had teachers who saw the nervousness in him and tried to understand it. He had relatives who called and begged and warned anyone who would listen that a child inside that house was going to die. And Anthony Avalos still died on the floor of that apartment, at 10 years old, 2 weeks after he graduated 4th grade, while the two people who were supposed to love him most not only stood by and watched, but chose it. Actively, repeatedly, deliberately, over 14 consecutive days. This is the story of Anthony Avalos. It is the story of a child who was failed by everyone whose job it was to protect him. It is the story of a mother who had every opportunity to break the cycle she was born inside and chose not to. It is the story of a man who brought a cruelty into that home that escalated everything into something with only one possible ending. And it is the story of a system so fractured and so overwhelmed and so indifferent that it looked at the same family 13 times and kept sending a little boy back to the place that was killing him. Let's get into it. To really understand this story, you have to understand the place where it happened, because the place matters. Lancaster, California is located in the northern stretch of Los Angeles County, in a high desert expanse called the Antelope Valley. And when people say Los Angeles County, you might picture the beaches, the palm trees, the traffic on Sunset Boulevard, the whole cinematic version of Southern California that gets exported everywhere. Lancaster is not that. Lancaster is flat and dry and wide open in a way that feels nothing like the coast. The summers are brutal, the kind of heat that isn't glamorous, just relentless. It's a working-class city, a commuter city, a place of families stretching budgets that never quite go far enough, of schools navigating complex caseloads of kids who are carrying more than most adults would know what to do with. It is also, and this detail will become important later, the same stretch of the Antelope Valley where Gabriel Fernandez lived and died in 2013. An 8-year-old boy in the nearby city of Palmdale, tortured to death by his mother and her boyfriend in circumstances so similar to Anthony's that the investigators, the journalists, and the child welfare advocates who eventually dug into both cases found themselves asking the same sickening question. How does this keep happening? in the same county, with the same agency, the same type of family, the same playbook of abuse, the same institutional failures playing out in slow motion while every warning sign flashed red? The answer to that question is a large part of what this story is about. The home at the center of everything was a modest apartment in a quiet Lancaster neighborhood. From the outside, a front door, some windows, children's shoes near the entry, it looked like any other home on the block. Nothing about it announced danger. Nothing about it would make you stop walking past and look twice. And in a story like this, that ordinariness is not incidental. It is the entire point. The danger was not hidden somewhere remote or inaccessible. It was on a regular street, behind a regular door, in a regular apartment complex. While a child was being destroyed just a wall away from neighbors who had no idea what was happening and institutions that had been told, repeatedly, and still did not act with the urgency that his situation required. Heather Barron had 7 children in approximately 8 years. She was young. She was financially strained. She was, by every clinical assessment conducted during the years that the Department of Children and Family Services was involved with her family, a mother whose capacity to provide safe, nurturing care for her children was described as severely limited. That was documented as far back as June 2014, 4 full years before Anthony died. The question this story demands we ask is not just what happened inside that apartment. It's why, with all of that documentation, all of those calls, and all of those professional assessments sitting right there in a growing file, Anthony Avalos was still in that home on the night it finally killed him. Anthony Avalos was born on May 4, 2008, and from everything his family, teachers, and classmates described, he was an extraordinarily present and warm and generous kid. He was the kind of child who noticed when someone was sad, the kind of kid who could make a room feel warmer just by walking into it. He loved dancing. He loved football. When his grades were good, which they frequently were, given he made the honor roll, his Uncle David would take him fishing at Apollo Park, and Anthony loved those trips in the way kids love things that feel like they were made specifically for them. His 4th grade teacher, whose name is Harmony Bell, took the witness stand at the murder trial in 2023 and broke down in tears describing him. She said he was everyone's best friend, and she did not mean that in a vague, general way. She described specific things he did, the way that when a new student joined the class, Anthony would ask to move his desk over to sit next to the newcomer so they wouldn't feel alone on their first day. He carried his Bible under his arm every single day. He brought Ms. Bell graham crackers from the cafeteria. She still has the letter he wrote her at the end of that school year. In it, Anthony wrote, "I just want to stay with you forever, but I can't. I just hope you have a good rest of your life, because you already know that I'm going to have a good life." He wrote that. He meant it. A 10-year-old boy who was living inside something unimaginable still believed, with his whole heart, that a good life was waiting for him on the other side of all of it. That detail, more than almost anything else in this story, is the one that stays with you. Ms. Bell also testified that she had noticed Anthony seemed often nervous about something. That nervousness, the particular tightly wound alertness of a child living in a state of constant unpredictability, was visible enough that his teacher saw it. But without more information, without the ability to connect the dots between what she observed and what was happening behind that apartment door, she could not have known that the nervousness was the surface expression of something catastrophic. She remembered it after he was gone. She has carried it since. Anthony had 6 siblings. He was the oldest, which in a household like the one he grew up in meant he was also the one who had been there the longest, who understood the rhythms and the dangers most acutely, who had developed, as children in abusive homes do out of sheer necessity, the hypervigilant internal radar for when things were stable and when they were about to turn. That kind of awareness is not a skill anyone wants to develop. It is the adaptation of a child who has learned, at an early age, that survival requires constant monitoring of the emotional temperature of the people who hold all the power. His family loved him fiercely. His Aunt Maria Barron, the wife of Heather's brother David, described him as a bright light. His Aunt Maricruz Avalos said his smile was constant, that it was just who he was, that it was on his face even when it had no business being there given everything he was living through. And when relatives spoke about him at his killer's sentencing hearing in April 2023, almost 5 years after his death, the grief in that courtroom was the specific, unprocessed grief of people who had tried to save someone and watched them get taken anyway. Heather Maxine Barron was born into a household that was already broken. At trial, her own siblings, her brother David Barron and her sister Crystal Diuguid, took the witness stand and described in painful detail what their childhood had looked like. Physical abuse, emotional abuse, a home shaped by violence and powerlessness, and the particular damage of growing up under the authority of adults who expressed control through cruelty. David and Crystal did not take that stand to excuse their sister. They testified because they had recognized what was happening to Anthony and his siblings, recognized it instantly, because they had lived through a version of it, and they had spent years trying to stop it. David called DCFS. Maria called DCFS. They took the children in whenever they could. David refused to let Heather take the kids home when Anthony told him what was happening at the apartment in September 2015. He called the police. He did everything right, and the system returned the children to their mother anyway. David Barron told the court that during one of his DCFS calls, he had specifically said he believed one of the children would be dead within 5 years if they remained in that home. It wound up being closer to 3. The psychological evaluation conducted in June 2014 described Barron's capacity to provide suitable care for her children as severely limited by her poor parenting skills, poor judgment, and denial and lack of awareness of her mental health issues. The evaluator's most important recommendation was individual therapy. Heather Barron refused. She said she was not interested in talking about the past. That refusal is one of the most consequential moments in this entire story, not because it determined everything, but because it reveals something about the nature of what the system was dealing with. Changing behavior rooted this deep in someone's history requires going back into that history and working through it. It cannot be addressed by parenting classes alone. Barron knew that going back into her past would be painful, and she chose not to do it. And the agency that had assessed her and recommended the therapy did not insist. They enrolled her in in-home parenting sessions instead, gave the case 6 months, and closed it with a note that read, "Mother has been compliant with services and receptive to outside resources." Anthony was 6 years old when that case closed. He had 8 more years to live. He would use only 4 of them. At trial, prosecutor Jonathan Hatami offered a characterization of the dynamic between Barron and Leiva that became one of the defining phrases of the case. Kareem was the enforcer, he said. Heather was the mastermind. Heather came up with the torture techniques and she got Leiva to do them. That framing, Barron as architect, not passive bystander, ran directly against the battered woman syndrome defense her attorney presented, but the evidence supported it. Beyond Barron's documented history of abusing her children before Leiva ever arrived, there were the torture methods themselves. The captain's chair, forcing children to squat against a wall for extended periods while holding weights, was described in testimony as something that originated with Barron. Leiva brought his own violence, but the cruelty in that home had 2 authors. Kareem Ernesto Leiva was 37 years old at sentencing. He entered Heather Barron's life in 2015, a relationship that would last several years and ultimately produce Barron's 7th child. He was physically imposing, standing 6 feet 1 inch tall and weighing approximately 200 pounds. He was, in the words that would eventually appear in courtroom testimony and judicial rulings, someone who frustrated easily and expressed that frustration through his body, through his hands, threw the full weight of a grown man brought down onto children who could not fight back. Within months of Leiva moving into the home, the biological father of one of Barron's younger children, a 2-year-old, was already calling police. The little boy showed up to supervised visits with bruises on his arm and his face every single time. During one visit, a social worker confirmed the bruising herself and documented that the child had repeatedly said, "Mommy is mean." The father reported that the bruises were there at every visit. Barron said the 2-year-old had fallen in the shower. A child at that age taking unsupervised showers and somehow falling in ways that produce fresh bruising in different locations at every visit. Most investigators, looking at that explanation against that backdrop, would struggle to find it credible. The referral was ruled unfounded anyway. In recorded police interviews after Anthony's death, Leiva admitted to multiple forms of physical abuse. He admitted to the belt. He admitted to the extension cord. He admitted to forcing Anthony and his siblings to kneel on uncooked rice as punishment. He admitted to physical violence against the children. What he denied, and what his defense attorney Dan Chambers argued all the way through closing arguments, was that any of what he had done rose to the level of intent to kill. Chambers told the court the evidence showed severe, extreme, out-of-bounds abusive behavior, but not murder. Judge Sam Oda disagreed, completely, and in writing. What made Leiva's abuse distinctive, beyond its severity, was its architecture. He was not a man who snapped in moments of rage and then came back to himself. He designed punishments. He constructed systems. The captain's chair, squatting against a wall while holding bricks or heavy books extended in your hands until your legs give out, is not an expression of temper. Rage does not involve props. Rage does not involve standing back and watching while a child's knees bleed into a pile of rice. What Leiva brought to that household, combined with what was already there, was something colder and more methodical and more deliberate than anger. It was the daily exercise of total control over human beings too small and too dependent to resist it. Crime scene photographs entered into evidence at trial showed a corner of the apartment where the carpet had been pulled back to expose bare concrete floor. In that exposed concrete corner, investigators found grains of uncooked rice. They found metal nails. That corner, a corner of an apartment where children were supposed to live and play and feel safe, had been transformed into a punishment station. It was set up. It was used. Repeatedly. Deliberately. Children bled into that rice. Between February 2013 and April 2016, the Los Angeles County Department of Children and Family Services received 13 formal referrals naming Anthony and his siblings as suspected victims of abuse. The agency followed up on 8 of those 13 referrals. At least 12 different social workers had contact with this family's case across those 4 years. Let those numbers land for a moment. 13 calls, 8 responses, 12 people whose professional responsibility was to look at this family and make a determination about whether those children were safe. And Anthony Avalos still died at age 10 in an apartment in Lancaster from dehydration and blunt force trauma to the head after 14 consecutive days of torture while his mother watched. The very first report came in February 2013. Anthony was 4 years old. He had reported that a family member, specifically his grandfather, had sawed him. DCFS substantiated the abuse, meaning they agreed that something had happened, and then closed the case, leaving it entirely in Heather Barron's hands to keep the perpetrator away from her son. There was no ongoing monitoring. He was 4 years old. In May 2014, another call came in, someone alleging that Barron was hitting the children with hoses and belts and locking them in their rooms. A neglect allegation was substantiated, and a voluntary case was opened, supervised by a social worker named Mark Millman. Services were arranged through an in-home provider called the Children's Center of the Antelope Valley. The reports from that provider were not encouraging, not from July, not from August, not from October. Every single progress report from the Children's Center said some variation of the same thing. This mother is overwhelmed, frustrated beyond her capacity, and showing no warmth toward any of her children, including the newborn. One counselor called the hotline directly after struggling to get Millman to take her concerns seriously. She reported that Barron was yanking children by the arm, yanking a daughter's hair while brushing it, and calling the children names like punk and bitch. She reported that Barron had a new baby and was showing zero nurturing behavior, not even toward the infant. The social worker assigned to investigate that October call documented that Barron and her children were interacting positively, and that mother and children had secure attachment as seen by their interaction. Barron herself admitted in that same interview to hitting the children with a belt and using hot sauce as punishment. That admission, on its own, was not enough to change the investigators' conclusion. The automated risk assessment tool, run as part of every DCFS investigation and using the family's documented history, came back flagging high risk and recommending that the case be elevated to a court case. The investigator overrode the recommendation. The referral was closed as inconclusive. The voluntary case was formally closed in December 2014. The case notes read, "Mother has been compliant with services and receptive to outside resources." Anthony was 6 years old. The family was then referred to a new counseling provider, Hathaway Sycamores. This is one of the most disturbing details in the DCFS failure narrative in this case, because Hathaway Sycamores was the exact same private agency that had provided counseling services to Gabriel Fernandez, the 8-year-old tortured and killed in Palmdale in 2013, and whose counselor, a woman named Barbara Dixon, had testified in the Fernandez case that she observed extensive injuries on Gabriel's body over multiple visits and did not report them to the hotline. Despite being a mandatory reporter, her notes from Gabriel's case sessions showed she counseled him to listen to his mother more attentively and to finish his homework. That counselor still had her job, and Anthony Avalos was assigned to her, the same counselor, the same agency, the same county, a different child, the same outcome. In September 2015, a pivotal and heartbreaking moment arrived. Anthony and some of his siblings were visiting their uncle David Barron. Away from the apartment in the safety of his uncle's home, Anthony told the truth. He and his 2 oldest siblings described to David, and then to a sheriff's deputy who responded to the scene, everything. The captain's chair, the beatings with the belt and extension cord, being locked in their rooms without food, Leiva hanging Anthony's brother from the stairs. The school principal called the hotline that same day. The sheriff's deputy called the next day. The DCFS investigator who came to interview Anthony heard him say, "Heather is my old mom. This is my new house. I am part of the Barron family now. I'm never going to see Heather again. She locks us up in our rooms and makes us starving." David Barron refused to let his sister take the children. He called the police. He did everything right. The DCFS investigator spoke with 3 staff members from Hathaway Sycamores, the same agency, the same one, who told her they were constantly in the home. The mother never hit the children. The kids never seemed frightened, and there were no locks on the doors. Their account directly contradicted everything the Children's Center counselors had been documenting the previous year. Based on those assurances from Hathaway Sycamores, and based on a determination that the aunt and uncle had manipulated the children into making the allegations, a determination made by an investigator who later testified in court that she was unaware, at the time, that abused survivors commonly recant once they are returned to their abuser, the referral was closed. Not surprisingly, every child recanted the moment they were back in Heather Barron's custody. The disposition read, "Situation stabilized." David Barron never saw his nephew again. The last referral on record came in April 2016. After that, the involvement of that social worker ended in October 2016. Barron moved the children to a new school, one that had no knowledge of Anthony's history. She cut ties with David and Maria. The agency closed its last open thread of connection to the family. For the 2 years before Anthony died, no institution had eyes on him. Nobody was watching. Nobody was looking. Nobody came. The 2019 California State Audit of DCFS, conducted in the aftermath of Anthony's death, alongside the deaths of Gabriel Fernandez and Noah Quattro, was devastating. It found that safety assessments were wrong in more than one-third of reviewed cases, that DCFS completed investigations within the state-mandated 30-day timeframe in only 30% of cases, and that supervisors typically reviewed cases only at the point of closure, meaning the critical decisions had already been made, without oversight, by the time anyone more senior was even looking at the file. Specific to Anthony's case, the audit identified 7 root causes of failure, including inappropriate termination of the voluntary family maintenance program, incorrect use of risk assessment tools, and a systemic failure to collaborate with law enforcement. One moment, perhaps above all others, crystallized the institutional indifference at the center of this failure. During the trial, prosecutors played a recording from the DCFS hotline, a recording of a DCFS employee receiving a description of abuse suffered by Anthony, while audibly laughing and making jokes in the background during the call. That recording was played in an open courtroom. DCFS sent media relations staff to monitor portions of the trial. The agency issued no formal public statement about the case. No DCFS employee was disciplined in connection with Anthony's death. The Los Angeles County Office of Child Protection, created in the direct aftermath of Gabriel Fernandez's death, with the explicit mandate of ensuring it never happened again, reviewed Anthony's case file and concluded that it could not say Anthony might still be alive today if the agency had done things differently, citing as justification the fact that the family had not been under active DCFS supervision at the time of his death. Many child welfare advocates characterized that conclusion as something close to a whitewash. The same office, created specifically so that Gabriel Fernandez would be the last child who fell through those gaps, had just looked at the next child who fell through them and said, "This one is different." In the final weeks of Anthony Avalos's life, something happened that the people who loved him would later describe as one of the most heartbreaking things about his story. Anthony told his mother that he liked boys and girls. He was 10 years old. He was living in a home where warmth was absent, where softness was dangerous, where the emotional temperature could shift without warning into something violent, and where the people with authority over him had demonstrated time and again that vulnerability was a liability. And in the middle of all of that, this little boy found something honest and true about himself and said it out loud. According to the account assembled by investigative reporter Garrett Thurolf from grand jury transcripts and interviews with the family, Kareem Leiva overheard that conversation. What followed that disclosure was not reflection or a difficult but necessary parenting moment. What followed, according to the testimony of Anthony's siblings and the findings of both the DCFS investigation and the criminal court, was the most savage and sustained escalation of abuse that those children had ever witnessed, as if Anthony's words had handed Leiva and Barron a new rationale, a new target, a new category of contempt to unleash. DCFS Deputy Director Brandon Nichols confirmed publicly after Anthony's death that the boy had made this disclosure in the weeks before he died, and that investigators were examining whether homophobia had played a role in the final escalation. Relatives of Anthony later confirmed that both Barron and Leiva had shown repeated evidence of homophobic attitudes. Relatives recounted Barron calling Anthony a slur. Leiva, in his police interviews, reportedly acknowledged being uncomfortable around gay people. This could imply, and most investigators who worked the case believed, that Anthony's honest disclosure of who he was functioned, in the minds of the two adults in that home, as a justification, as if something they had perhaps been directing at him in part had now been given a reason, a label, a permission. Judge Oda would later write in his verdict that both defendants had targeted Anthony as a scapegoat for extreme cruelty, and that he served as the chosen target to gain some level of relief from their troubles. The disproportionate singling out of Anthony, treated measurably, documented worse than the other children in the home, was a finding the court made clearly and without ambiguity. Maria Barron, Anthony's aunt by marriage, said after the verdict, "Anthony's disclosure took tremendous courage. She was right. Think about what it takes for a 10-year-old boy living inside that environment to say something honest about himself, to be willing to be seen and known as he truly was, even in a place that had taught him that being seen as vulnerable could cost him everything. He had that courage anyway. He deserved, at minimum, to be safe enough to use it." June 7, 2018. Anthony Avalos graduated from 4th grade. He had made the honor roll. He walked across that stage, and then he went home. From the day of that graduation to the afternoon of June 20th, Anthony Avalos was subjected to sustained, daily, targeted abuse, 14 consecutive days of it, so methodical and so sustained, and so deliberate that Judge Oda described it in his written verdict as torture in the truest legal and moral sense of the word. Not an outburst, not a series of escalating incidents, a 14-day campaign. Prosecutors laid out in their opening statements what those 2 weeks looked like, and what they described was not the kind of thing you can listen to passively. Anthony was forced to kneel on uncooked dry rice on a concrete floor every single day. He was made to do it for so long that he bled on the rice. A child abuse expert who testified at the trial said the damage to his knees was the worst she had ever seen in her professional career. While he knelt on that rice, a vacuum cord was used to strike him repeatedly across his body. He was forced to hold weights, books, or bricks over his head with his arms extended for extended periods of time while he held the captain's chair position squatting against the wall. He was locked in his room. His face was rubbed into a urine-soaked carpet. Hot sauce was put in his eyes, his nose, his mouth. Food was withheld. Water was withheld. He was force-fed peanut butter and hot sauce when they did give him food. He had cigarette burns on his body. The children in the house were forced to fight each other. Chokeholds. Physical confrontations that were not roughhousing. They were organized, directed by the adults in the room. Anthony's half-siblings, Destiny and Raphael, and one of Leiva's own daughters were all present and forced, at various points, to watch. They were children themselves, 11, 12, 13 years old. They watched their brother suffer and said nothing because there was nothing they could say, nowhere they could go, and no adult in that apartment who was going to make it stop. On June 18th, one of the children reported witnessing Leiva pin Anthony by the neck against the wall. When he let go, Anthony's body, appearing completely limp, completely lifeless, fell to the floor with a loud impact sound. They tried to revive him. He remained unconscious. He stayed that way. And then he lay on the floor of that apartment for 2 full days. 2 days. While Heather Barron and Kareem Leiva remained in that home with him. 2 days is not shock. 2 days is not paralysis. 2 days is a decision, made and remade every hour, the decision not to pick up a phone. Based on what Judge Oda later concluded about the coordinated nature of their cover-up attempts, it is reasonable to infer that at least part of those 2 days involved calculating what story to tell, rather than any genuine belief that Anthony might recover on his own. Destiny O, who was 13 years old when she testified, told the court through tears what the house felt like during those final days. Prosecutor Hatami asked her at one point, "And what did Mommy do?" Destiny's answer was one word: nothing. Imagine being one of those other children, 7, 8 years old, lying in the dark, hearing your brother, knowing that there is no phone you can reach and no neighbor close enough and no version of tomorrow that looks different from today. That is the full picture of what was built inside that Lancaster apartment. Not just Anthony's suffering, the suffering of every child who was made to witness it and live inside it and carry it forward from there. The ones who survived are carrying it still. There is a detail in this case that stands above almost all the others in terms of what it reveals about the nature of what was done to Anthony, and that detail is the water. Judge Oda found specifically, in his written verdict, that both defendants worked together to deprive Anthony of liquids for a substantial period of time. That finding is worth sitting with carefully. Dehydrating a person is not an act of violence in the conventional sense. It does not happen in a moment. It does not happen because someone lost their temper. Dehydrating a child requires, every single hour that child is thirsty and suffering, a renewed decision not to give him water. It requires choosing, again and again and again, across days to continue doing it. By the time paramedics arrived on June 20th, Anthony's veins had collapsed from dehydration. An emergency room physician testified at trial that his veins were so depleted they could not function properly, that his body had been so systematically starved of liquid that the basic circulatory infrastructure had failed. His kidneys had shut down completely. The doctor said that even if Anthony had somehow survived, which he had no realistic chance of doing, he would have required dialysis for the rest of his life. The dehydration alone was fatal. Everything else was in addition to that. The medical examiner determined the cause of death as severe dehydration and blunt force trauma to the head, the culmination of the final night's violence when Leiva picked Anthony up by his feet and slammed his head into the floor repeatedly, which was the same thing he had done to Anthony across those 14 days, just with final consequences on June 18th. The condition of Anthony's body told anyone with medical training everything they needed to know. This was not one incident. This was not a moment that got out of hand. This was the end result of a sustained, coordinated, deliberate effort to destroy a child. The afternoon of June 20th, 2018, Anthony Avalos had been lying unconscious on the floor of that Lancaster apartment for 2 days. At some point in that afternoon, Heather Barron picked up a phone and dialed 911. In the audio recording of that call, played in open court during the trial, you can hear the operator answer, and then you can hear Barron respond. "My son's not breathing, my son's not breathing." Judge Oda would later note in his written verdict that Barron had waited to call 911 until Anthony was literally deceased, and he described it as a flagrant lack of care for Anthony's life. Paramedics arrived and found Anthony with no pulse, not breathing, his body showing multiple abrasions and cigarette burns, his ribs visible through his skin. He was in full cardiac arrest. Paramedics worked to restore a pulse. They succeeded, at least temporarily. He was stabilized enough to be rushed first to a local hospital and then airlifted to UCLA Mattel Children's Hospital in Los Angeles, where doctors assessed the full extent of what had been done to him. When Barron arrived at the hospital, multiple doctors and nurses who interacted with her later testified at trial that her behavior was immediately and consistently wrong. They said she displayed surprisingly little genuine emotion, that she appeared to be forcing herself to cry, performing grief rather than feeling it, in a way that struck trained emergency medicine professionals as unmistakably performative. One doctor testified that Barron seemed to actually blame Anthony for his own condition. And in her initial statement to paramedics, Barron said Anthony had hurt himself that morning. Judge Oda explicitly addressed that claim in his verdict. He said it was scientifically impossible for Anthony to have hurt himself that morning, given the state of his body. The level of dehydration alone indicated that he may not have had any liquids for 5 days or more. The injuries on his body were not consistent with a single incident. He had been there on that floor for 2 days before the call was made. The cover story collapsed under the weight of basic medical evidence. Anthony Avalos was pronounced dead at UCLA Mattel Children's Hospital on June 21, 2018. He was 10 years old. He had graduated from 4th grade 14 days earlier. He had written his teacher a letter telling her he was going to have a good life. He weighed 77 pounds. He should have started 5th grade in September. Heather Barron and Kareem Leiva were arrested in the summer of 2018. In August 2019, The Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office announced it was seeking the death penalty against both of them. Both were charged with first-degree murder, with the special circumstances allegation of murder involving the infliction of torture, as well as torture charges and child abuse counts involving two of Anthony's half-siblings. Destiny O. and Raphael O. both pleaded not guilty. Both were held without bail. Then a significant shift occurred. Following the November 2020 election of District Attorney George Gascon, whose office issued a blanket directive that death is never an appropriate resolution in any case, the death penalty was removed for both defendants. Gascon's office also initially sought to remove the special circumstances allegation, the finding that would ensure a mandatory sentence of life without parole, but lead prosecutor Jonathan Hatami, who had also been the lead prosecutor in the Gabriel Fernandez case, and who was a vocal and public critic of Gascon's policies, refused to follow that directive and maintained the allegation. The special circumstances finding stood. If convicted, both defendants would face life in prison with no possibility of parole. In January 2023, before the criminal trial concluded, the Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors formally approved a $32 million civil settlement between the county and Anthony's family. At the time, one of the largest settlements of its kind in the county's history. The civil lawsuit had accused DCFS and multiple social workers of deliberate indifference, the legal standard that goes beyond simple negligence into a conscious and sustained disregard of known risk. The settlement came with no admission of wrongdoing by DCFS, which is standard legal practice in such agreements. Whether that standard practice feels sufficient when applied to the death of a 10-year-old boy who had 13 calls made on his behalf is a question Anthony's family, and most people who know this story, have a clear answer to. Both Barron and Leiva waived their right to a jury trial. The case would be decided by Los Angeles County Superior Court Judge Sam Oda in a bench trial, a decision that defense attorneys sometimes advise in cases where facts are so emotionally overwhelming that a lay jury might evaluate them through a lens of grief and outrage rather than strict legal analysis. Whether that calculation helped either defendant is another matter. The trial ran for approximately 5 weeks through January and February 2023. DCFS sent media relations staff to observe portions of it. The agency issued no public statement. The prosecution's opening statements, delivered by Jonathan Hatami, set the tone for everything that followed. He described the 14-day torture campaign in specific, clinical detail. He described Leiva as brutally torturing and intentionally murdering a 10-year-old boy. He told Judge Oda that the evidence would show that both defendants knew exactly what they were doing, that the dehydration alone, which required a sustained, coordinated daily refusal to give Anthony water, proved deliberate intent beyond any reasonable doubt. He said that between them, Barron and Leiva had 12 children. He said some of the children in the house had been forced to fight each other. He said Anthony had been singled out for the worst of it, consistently and deliberately, in a way that the children who witnessed it were traumatized by in their own right. Anthony's half-siblings Destiny O. and Raphael O., still teenagers when they testified, took the stand and described what they had seen inside that apartment. Destiny described watching Leiva drop Anthony headfirst to the floor. She described the sounds of the house during those final 2 weeks. She described asking Barron what was happening to Anthony and being met with silence. Raphael, when asked who he blamed for Anthony's death, looked out at the courtroom and said, "Kareem." The defense argument from Leiva's attorney, Dan Chambers, was that while the abuse was severe, extreme, and indefensible, the evidence did not support a finding of intent to kill. He said he would demonstrate inconsistencies in the medical evidence and in the testimony of the child witnesses. He said his client should be convicted of child abuse, which carries a very different sentence, rather than murder. Barron's attorney deferred on giving an opening statement and eventually built the defense around battered woman syndrome. The argument that Barron herself was a victim of Leiva's violence, that he dominated and controlled the household, and that she lacked the agency and the power to protect Anthony even if she had wanted to. It is a recognized and legitimate legal defense in the right circumstances. But the prosecution's evidence, the documented history of Barron's abuse of her children before Leiva arrived, the specific torture methods attributed to her, the behavior at the hospital, the coordinated cover story, made it an extremely difficult argument to sustain in the face of the full record. During closing arguments, Hatami delivered the phrase that became the headline of the entire case. He called both defendants nothing short of monsters. He told the judge, Anthony was helpless. Anthony was a child, and he was murdered by the two people who were supposed to love and protect him the most. On March 7, 2023, Judge Sam Oda delivered his verdict. He found both Heather Barron and Kareem Leiva guilty of first-degree murder and torture in the death of Anthony Avalos. He found them guilty of 2 counts of child abuse involving Destiny O and Raphael O, and he upheld the special circumstances allegation, murder involving the infliction of torture, which under California law required the only available sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. When the first guilty finding was read, some of Anthony's relatives in the gallery said yes, aloud. Neither Barron nor Leiva visibly reacted as the judge worked through his findings. The written verdict that Judge Oda issued went far beyond a simple announcement of guilt. He detailed his reasoning with the specificity and moral clarity that this case demanded. He found that testimony from Anthony's half-siblings and from one of Leiva's own daughters demonstrated clearly that both defendants had participated in the abuse. He found that the medical evidence made Barron's claim that Anthony had hurt himself that morning scientifically impossible. He found that both defendants had worked together to deprive Anthony of liquids for a substantial period of time, causing the catastrophic dehydration that shut down his kidneys and collapsed his veins. He wrote that the evidence supported the conclusion that both defendants hurt Anthony for pleasure, not in rage, not from overwhelm, for pleasure. He wrote that Anthony was helpless to protect himself against the wrath of both defendants. He wrote that both defendants targeted Anthony as a scapegoat for extreme cruelty, and that he served as the chosen target to gain some level of relief from their troubles. That language, scapegoat, pleasure, relief from their troubles, is precise legal language in the hands of a judge trained in the careful use of words. It is not rhetorical flourish. It is the court of law's formal finding about why a 10-year-old boy was tortured to death. The court looked at everything, every piece of evidence, every hour of testimony, every detail in that 50-page written ruling, and said, these two people chose this, deliberately, knowingly, for their own purposes. On April 25, 2023, Heather Barron, then 33, and Kareem Leiva, then 37, stood before Judge Oda for sentencing. Anthony's family filled the gallery. 17 of them made statements, teenagers, young adults, relatives of all ages, people who had spent nearly 5 years in the legal system waiting for this moment. Destiny O, 13 years old at the time, Anthony's half-sister, someone who had been inside that apartment during those 14 days, stood before the court and said, "It has been 5 long years without my brother, my best friend, my whole world, Anthony Avalos. Anthony was a ball of sunshine to everyone. Sadly, because of you two monsters, he is not here anymore." She addressed Leiva directly. She addressed Barron directly, no longer calling her a mother. She said Barron did not protect them and took part in the torture. And then she said something that has stayed with everyone who was in that room. She said if she could go back and live through all of it again, she would, if it meant it could have been her instead of Anthony. Maria Barron stood up and told the court that years before Anthony died, in the aftermath of Gabriel Fernandez's murder in 2013, she had a conversation with Heather Barron. Heather had said she could never be like Gabriel Fernandez's mother, Pearl, Maria looked at Heather across that courtroom in 2023 and said, "Guess what? You're just like her. Even worse." Barron wept quietly throughout the hearing. Leiva showed no visible reaction. Judge Oda sentenced both to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He had no other option under the law. He used it. Prosecutor Jonathan Hatami, who had spent years on this case and years before it on Gabriel Fernandez's case, said after the sentencing, "Nobody won in this case. I never win in any of my cases. We can't bring Anthony back. And we still have a Department of Children and Family Services that keeps failing our children. But I do believe that the two people most responsible for Anthony's death have been found guilty. They are going to be held responsible for what they did." And Anthony's voice was heard loud and clear in court. In July 2025, a California state appeals court upheld both convictions. A three-justice panel from California's 2nd District Court of Appeal, Associate Justice Michelle C. Kim writing for the panel, with Acting Presiding Justice Helen I. Bendix and Associate Justice Gregory J. Weingart concurring, issued a 14-page ruling that matched the moral weight of the original verdict. Justice Kim wrote that the extremity of the treatment Barron and Leiva inflicted on Anthony demonstrated far more violence than that necessary to discipline him for his supposed disobedience, and provided substantial evidence to support the conclusion that they intended to inflict extreme and prolonged pain for some other purpose. She continued, "The amount of pain and suffering caused by prolonged dehydration and repeated blunt force trauma to the head would be immediately apparent to anyone." The evidence supported the court's finding that the purpose was sadistic. Sadistic, that word in a formal judicial ruling written by a jurist trained in the precise use of legal language, is not rhetorical. It is a legal finding. It is a court of law saying, the evidence shows these two people tortured a child because they wanted to, not because they lost control, not because they didn't know better, because they wanted to. The convictions stood. The sentences stood. Anthony's family finally had an answer that the legal system could give them, not closure, because there is no such thing in cases like this, but a permanent, formal, appellate-confirmed answer about what was done to their child and why. The $32 million civil settlement reached in January 2023 was, at the time, one of the largest of its kind in Los Angeles County history. It came with no admission of wrongdoing, as all such settlements do, and that legal language cannot be allowed to obscure what the settlement actually represents. A county government paid $32 million to the family of a 10-year-old boy who died, while 12 of its workers had touched his case, while the system had received 13 calls naming him as a victim, while 2 of the agency's own automated risk assessment tools had come back recommending escalation and been overridden by individual workers, and the official position remains that no one did anything wrong. The civil lawsuit named 3 cases as evidence of systemic DCFS failure: Gabriel Fernandez, Anthony Avalos, and Noah Quattro, a 4-year-old killed by his parents just weeks after Anthony's death, in circumstances that once again bore unmistakable similarities. 3 children, 3 families, 3 communities devastated, all in the same county, all failed by the same agency, all dead in the years after the reforms that were supposed to prevent exactly this. The state audit identified 7 specific root causes of failure in Anthony's case alone. Multiple investigations noted that no DCFS employee was disciplined. The Office of Child Protection, created because Gabriel Fernandez died, looked at Anthony's death and concluded it could not say things would have been different if the agency had acted differently. That conclusion, from an oversight body created specifically to prevent the next Gabriel Fernandez, is the kind of institutional response that tells you more about the depth of the problem than any number of policy documents. Supervisor Catherine Barger said in the immediate aftermath of Anthony's death, "You had teachers, you had family members, you had law enforcement come in contact, and yet Anthony is at the morgue. Teachers, family members, law enforcement, every layer of civic infrastructure that is supposed to exist for the protection of children had contact with Anthony Avalos across those 4 years. And Anthony is at the morgue. Anthony's case also opened an overdue conversation about how LGBTQ children in vulnerable home environments are evaluated by child welfare systems. His disclosure, made weeks before the most lethal escalation of abuse, raises questions that are not abstract policy debates, but matters of life and death for children living in homes where their identity creates additional danger. Are social workers trained to identify and document homophobia as a risk factor? Are there protocols for flagging a child's safety when their identity makes them more vulnerable in their own household? Advocates pushed for those questions to be formalized in DCFS policy. Whether those pushes resulted in meaningful change remains an active and urgent concern. What remains, when you have gone through every court record and every investigative report and every piece of testimony, is the photograph. The one where Anthony is grinning, his whole face lit up, like he is 1 second away from laughing out loud. That photograph exists in permanent, devastating tension with everything else in this story. And what it does, what photographs of the living always do when the person is gone, is refuse to let the worst of the story be the whole story. It insists that Anthony Avalos was not defined by the suffering inflicted on him. That he existed, fully, richly, loudly, with dancing and football and fishing trips and graham crackers for his teacher and a Bible under his arm, and a smile that was apparently just his default, before any of this happened to him, and despite all of it while it was happening. He was the fastest runner in his grade. He was the kid who moved his desk next to the new student. He was the kid who wrote his teacher a letter saying he was going to have a good life and meant every word. He was 10 years old when he was killed, in an apartment in Lancaster, California, after 13 calls to a child protection hotline that didn't save him, after 12 social workers who cycled through his file and moved on, after a county system that paid $32 million and admitted nothing, and after 14 consecutive days of deliberate, targeted, methodical cruelty, inflicted by 2 people whose life sentence an appeals court later described with one word: sadistic. He should be 17 years old right now. He should be in high school, maybe figuring out who he is, maybe dancing, maybe making everyone around him laugh without really trying, maybe navigating with the ordinary messiness and grace of a teenager the things he had already courageously begun to work out about himself. He should have had all of that. He should have had a good life. He told Ms. Bell so. He believed it. The very least we can do, the absolute minimum, is say his name, understand what happened to him, hold the full truth of it clearly enough that we refuse to accept the version of this story that ends with a settlement and no admission and a file stamped closed. Anthony Avalos deserved the protection of every system that looked at him and looked away. He deserved the adults in his life to do their jobs. He deserved to be safe enough to say who he was without it costing him everything. Nobody came for Anthony Avalos. That cannot be undone. But what we do with what we now know, that part is still ours. Rest well, Anthony. The world knows your name. We see you now. We're sorry it took this long.